My presentation is on models matter. They matter a lot. And we sometimes find people who are disregarding the models that have worked so well for so long. So I hope that people hear the message behind this, that you really need to stick with the models. Deviations ought to be seen as exceptions, and when those exceptions are finished, we need to move back to the models, okay? Very, very important. The Cambridge English Dictionary describes a model as something that a copy can be based on because it is an extremely good example of a type. And that's what the models we offer are, extremely good examples of how it should be done. A model is a system or a thing used as an example to follow or to imitate. And we have lots of models in psychological systems. We have lots of models in crisis intervention. We have hit upon a series of models within CISM that have proven utility. They work. And we have even some randomized controlled trials to say that they work. So a model is also something that's an example of something perfect. And it's a standard to be imitated. And there have been a number of things that have happened over the last several years that give me concern about what people are doing with the model. As you can see by this Kubler-Ross change curve, which I'm not going to teach, that's why I made it so small. It's not my job here to teach about Kubler-Ross, but it's a model, okay? Here's another example, which is the stress model of crisis. And again, I'm not here to teach those models. I'm not teaching Fred's model. I don't know who Fred is, but I'm not teaching his model. Guess what model I'm going to talk about, okay? It's the model that I helped develop. And we have a continuum of school mental health services model. I'm not here to teach that. I'm just telling you, there's lots of models out there. People create these models for a reason, okay? And they have some importance to them. Now, this is an interesting copy of a slide that was made in 1991, and I have to congratulate the Civil Air Patrol because they did it right. They asked permission to use the model in their work. They did not distort, change, alter, or abandon the model. And at the bottom, they actually credit the author of the model, okay? That's credibility. So congrats to the Civil Air Patrol for setting a model for others to follow, which is let's do it right, okay? Now this happens to be the CISD model, and we know that since that model was developed, other models have come into play within the field of critical incident stress management, okay? Now, models have important roles. What do models do? They help explain things, right? Things sometimes that are complicated, difficult to work with. I remember when Chip Theodore was alive, and he was one of our very earliest peer support personnel. Chip approached me before the very first article on critical incident stress debriefing came out, and he said, "We need you to come to Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax, and we need you to train us about how to use the model." And my response to him was, "Well, Chip, I wrote the article. It's coming out. Just give it a month and you'll see it." After the article came out, Chip called me up and he said, "Okay, thanks. Good description. Now we need you to come and train." And I said, "But Chip, it's in the article. It's simple." And Chip's words in return were, "Jeff, the concepts are simple. The applications can be a challenge. So we need you to come and train us. And Chip was never a person in my life to have me say no. When he kept being persistent like that, I went and I trained their team. It was the very first team trained in the United States. Okay? So models help us to explain things. They help us to organize not only our thinking, but it helps us to organize our interventions. They instruct. They provide education. Models standardize. And if we don't standardize, when the big one hits, we can't work together because we'll all be doing different things, and we think we have our own little fancy model to work with. Let's take the state of Kentucky for a positive example, okay? Positive example. We sent into the state of Kentucky during the Great Flood that they had there 64 different individuals who came from 14 different critical incident stress management teams, and they came from 7 different states, and they had never met each other before. And my brother Doug, who many of you know from previous congresses, he was sent down to represent ICISF as the on-site CISM coordinator in the Kentucky flooding. And when these individuals began to arrive, Doug said to them, "We're not doing debriefings right now. It's too early." And they said, "Okay, what do you want us to do?" And he said, "CMBs, one-on-ones, okay? We have to be careful with the interactive groups. They're not in a place where they can have that yet. They're not ready for it. And many of these groups that we're dealing with are not going to be the right kind of group to do interactive functions." And he was absolutely right on that. He set the standards. And 64 people in the state of Kentucky from 7 states and 14 different critical incident stress management teams worked together as if one. Why? They had models to rely on to keep the standards in practice. Okay? Models count. Models work. Models matter. All right? Models help us to structure. They help our understanding. They help to build even better theory base. You know, a lot of times the theory base starts it and then the model follows it. But once you have the model, you can help to inform the theory building. Models become blueprints for action. They help us in making plans for complicated interventions. Models help us to prioritize. They provide guidance. They help us to assess the impact on the personnel. You know, a lot of people think about nature and magnitude of event, and you know what they forget? The other side of that formula is impact on personnel. Nature and magnitude of event is only half the formula. It's half the model. If you do an assessment, you got to look at nature, you got to look at magnitude of event, and on the other side, you have to look at what is the impact on the personnel who have been exposed to that situation. Models help us to do that. Models help us to modify when circumstances warrant a modification, and they help us to have a home to return to when the modification is finished. Because modification should not be abandonment of the model as we know it. It should be a temporary move for circumstances beyond our control, and then we should return to the model. The models count. The models work. Time-honored theory, practice, and research should support our model. We don't just do a model because, oh, overnight I thought of it and it sounds so good. Is there research? Is there theory? Is there practice behind it? Absence those things, I think you want to be very careful taking on a new model. You may pick up something that could actually be harmful to people. Be careful. These models that we use have been tested over time, and they have shown themselves worthy of the trust we put in them. The models that are using on-it theory and practice and research, they assure us that we have appropriate intervention. They prevent costly mistakes. Models reduce risk. And when you have people who have suffered a traumatic event, they are at risk. And we should not take that lightly. We should make sure that we are doing what has been tested over time and what we now know provides little risk to them because we're sticking to an appropriate model. We need to encourage those who need assistance, and that's what this kind of reference to theory, practice, and research does. We need to confirm the quality of care. Are we providing them what's really going to benefit them? Or are we just willy-nilly picking something off the shelf that we have no idea whether it works or doesn't work, but we're willing to experiment? You want them to experiment on your brother, your sister, your wife, your father, your mother? You want them to experiment in the midst of a chaotic situation called a crisis? I would not want experimentation done on my family members, and I think you should not have it on yours as well. Models reduce risk. They encourage those who need assistance. They confirm the quality of our care. They enhance recovery. And the evidence supports that. The CISM model has the longest record and the strongest research of any of the crisis intervention models available to date. Why are people happy to just let it go when we got a sure thing? It amazes me. Significant diversions from established models have a great potential for going off track and causing harm. And the very first thing that I worked on, because I developed the CISD model 9 years before I ever taught it. Why did it take 9 years? Because I had one thing in mind. Do no harm. Do no harm. And I tested it and played with it and worked it and got consultation from people who had experienced it. And then it became a model. 9 years after I had developed it. Okay? Let's not get off track. What are the dangers? The dangers are emotional shutdown in the people who are supposedly trying to help. Depression, anxiety, loss of faith, loss of hope, anger, rage, resentment, inability to resolve distress or heal the wounds, resistance to professional support because what was offered at the crisis and intervention level didn't work, and now they're hesitant to move on to what might help them. Non-compliance with intervention programs, marital discord, post-traumatic stress disorder, our favorite friend. It might not have occurred had they had proper early intervention. Suicidal ideation and actions. That's a great price to pay for messing around and experimenting instead of sticking with what we know works. An experiment in a laboratory environment, okay, but not out in the field. The theory, practice, and research behind CISM actually started in 1870-71 during the Franco-Prussian War. That was one of those wars where some prince insulted somebody else's prince. You know, the wars start like that. And then what happened was there was an exodus of French troops off the front lines. Paris was nearly surrounded. They were at great risk of losing, and they would have to surrender Paris, which would then be destroyed. So French medical officers did the first crisis intervention. Now, there was an experiment. Hundreds if not thousands of troops coming off the front line. And the French medical officers thought, to save France, to save the country, to save Paris, we need to do something. And what did the French do? They removed soldiers from the combat arena. They could hear the cannon fire in the distance. They provided rest, food, fluid. Hey, it was France, it was wine. Okay? Rest, food, fluid, opportunity to speak to a medical officer. Okay? And reuniting with their colleagues from their own units, their own platoons, their own squads. Okay? And guess what? The exodus of French soldiers leaving the front line slowed and gradually reversed, and the French were able to man the trenches, and they held the line, and the French were successful in negotiating a peace. They had to give up stuff. Alsace-Lorraine plays a role in World War I, World War II. They had to give up stuff. But Paris did not fall. The first time Christ's intervention was used in the history of the world that we know of, other than what shows up in the Bible and what shows up in documents that were written from the ancient times till now. But we didn't have a formula, and the French came up with the formula. Everybody thinks, oh, we must have invented it in the American Civil War. Au contraire, we did not invent it. I know Americans like to think we're first and we invent everything. Sorry, we don't. We didn't invent Christ's intervention. And guess what happened in the Civil War? They got a nifty name for what we now know as PTSD, and it was called Soldier's Heart. Soldier's Heart. But what did we do about post-traumatic stress disorder in the Civil War? We did zip, zero, and nada. We did nothing. Nobody knew what to do with it. Nobody truly understand crisis intervention. Okay? Then Edward Sterling comes along. He's MD, Ph.D. He was a Swiss psychiatrist. And he became interested in disaster. And he did quite a few disasters and wrote some very important articles on that. He found resiliency in children after a disaster. It doesn't always turn out bad, resiliency. He found vulnerability in the elderly. They had grown used to life as it was, and suddenly this disaster threw them overboard. One of the things that Edward Sterling found was that 25% of the victims he studied ended up with post-trauma sleep disturbance. Okay? Theory, practice, research behind the models. Where we are now came from somewhere. Theory, practice, and research behind CSM. Thomas Salmon, psychiatrist, volunteered for duty in the European Theater Award in World War I. And he did a study which was published in 1919. But one of the things he found was that if you provided early intervention, he was able to get American soldiers back to operational function, and he was able to do that in 3 to 4 days. 65% of troops returned to combat when dealt with in the field, just behind the front lines, within earshot of cannon fire. Okay? And when he had troops moved to a rear hospital, only 45% of those soldiers returned to combat, and that took 3 to 4 weeks to account for instead of the 3 to 4 days. Eric Lindemann wrote a book in 1944 on crisis intervention. It's one of the first crisis intervention texts. In the same year, he wrote what was to become one of the very first papers on the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, because at that time it wasn't called post-traumatic stress disorder, but he authored that book. And he was very active in providing support after the Coconut Grove fire, famous nightclub fire in Boston, Massachusetts, occurred in November 1942. And he worked closely with Gerald Kaplan. They worked together. Gerald Kaplan was a great theorist in crisis intervention. That theory remains intact today, and it is worldwide the preferred theory of crisis intervention. Is that Gerald Kaplan? Lest you think that these folks were Americans, Eric Lindemann was German, and Gerald Kaplan was British. See, we don't invent everything. They just happen to live here and become citizens, right? The theory, practice, and research behind CISM, the American military forces working through the Walter Reed Army Medical Center did some studies in 2008. They did a group randomized trial of critical incident stress debriefing. Did you ever hear that? Critical incident stress debriefing, right? Became a randomized control trial. And then they went on and they did another study in 2009. They did the same procedures. They changed the name. They acknowledged that they were changing the name because battle mind debriefing seemed to work better for troops as a label than did critical incident stress debriefing. So they acknowledged what they were doing, and they did it, and we gave our blessing for that to happen, okay? And Adler and her colleagues then looked at battle mind debriefing as an early intervention with soldiers returning from Iraq. They were randomized by platoon. It was a randomized control trial, and the outcomes were positive. The theory, practice, and research again. Tuckey, Scott worked together, did group critical incident stress debriefing. You might have heard of that before again. Okay. With emergency services personnel, it was a randomized control trial, appeared in anxiety, stress, and coping. And then David Richards did a field study of CISD versus CISM. You could probably predict that if you do nothing, it doesn't work very well. If you do CISD alone, it has some positive effect. When you combine CISD with other intervention tactics, that was the strongest. So you have a model that's using closely aligned other models. And Flannery did the Assaulted Staff Action Program, which is in 2001 was a 10-year empirical support for critical incident stress management. Very positive outcomes. Boscarino talked about a critical incident stress management program for employees of businesses after the World Trade Center in New York City. Positive outcome. The research is there to support the models. Okay? Now, we have familiar models that all of us are aware of if you've trained in CISM. If not, we would invite you to get that training soon. We have the Safer Or model, which is something that George Everly developed, and that's for working with individuals in crisis. We have the RITS, which used to be known as demobilization. It was a borrowed military term. Military wanted it back. They had guns. We decided to give up the term. Okay, so it's now called Rest Information Transition Services. And then we have CMB, Crisis Management Briefing. George and I were doing it for a couple of decades before he and Sherry Castellano wrote about it, and then it really became formalized. We were doing the model before, but now it was accepted as a model within CISM. And diffusing is a model that is what you do early on, right after the incident occurs. And then we have CISD, which I've already been talking about to this point. And then we have the post-action staff support model, which takes care of our people after they've intervened to help others. So those are models. Another model we have is target type, timing, theme, and team, the 5T formula for assessing what do we have on hand, what do we need to do about it, what types of interventions would we use, the timing of those interventions, what are the themes and the issues and concerns with those interventions, and do we have the right team members to match the need? Target type, timing, theme, and team. These are models, okay? And they have real benefit. And people who've been using them a long time will tell you that it has worked. So we have now found that despite the risk of harm to military emergency services personnel and community members that we serve, some use our model by abandoning it and coming up with something else that they invented or they think they invented. It's not based on the research. Sometimes it's just out of the sky, okay? And they abandon or alter the research-backed CISM models for unproven interventions. Got a proven intervention? Feel free to use it. Not proven? Pretty risky, okay? Some abandon the models altogether, risk harm to others. Some change the name of the models and then claim that the new model is theirs. Just because they change the name of the model doesn't mean it's yours. It means that you're violating international copyright laws. That's what it means, okay? So you're successful in doing that for a while. Some use the name of the model but have changed its internal content. That falls under the category of fraud, okay? That's not good, all right? In violation of agreements with ICISF, there are some countries that don't register their courses, even after they have written and signed documents that said they will adhere to ICISF standards. Some have decided to steal ICISF materials and reprint them without paying appropriate royalties or even asking permission. Sad. Some ICISF-approved instructors allow other people who lack appropriate training to train others in CISM and sign certificates saying that those people had appropriate training, even though the instructors they chose have not been trained in CISM. The motives for these illegal and immoral behaviors may be personal financial gain, who knows, and self-promotion without regard to those who suffer the consequences, which could be the people they claim to be serving. I worry about those things. And I have been in a position on numerous occasions to pick up people who received poor service because nobody was following models, okay? And those who do these things know who they are, but unfortunately, they're not hearing this message. I doubt that they're sitting in this room. We know who some of you are, and some of you out there know who's doing these things, okay? And everybody should be reminded that those behaviors are illegal, immoral, and unethical, okay? The abandonment, alteration, renaming, and stealing of CISM models really has to stop. It's getting ridiculous. It's really pathetic, okay? We need to upstand and hold up the things that we do and protect it from people who are taking it and using it inappropriately and possibly causing harm. And I put this challenge out to all of us. Do the right thing. Do the right thing. Be honorable in what you do. You have a much better chance of really helping people if we do the right thing, okay? And I thank you for your time. Thank you for being here at the World Congress, and I hope that you're going away learning something, because our objective is that you learn and that you and all of us do a better job. We do the right thing. Thank you.